Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva and I've been doing live streams on various Christian topics. And today is part 5 of the series called The History of Judaism. So let's go ahead and get started. So the title of part 5 is From Slavery to Kingdom. And last time we covered from Abraham to Joseph. And again, this is through the lens of God's promises and his supernatural interventions, or you can call them miracles. And we want to see how God created this nation, the nation of Israel, why he had to create it, who he had to create it through. And we want to look at it through this lens, the promises that God gave to people, and the miracles, the supernatural interventions that he did in order to establish that. Just a bit of review. We covered Genesis chapter 12 through 50. And I won't go over all of this information, but you can look at it, or pause the video and look at it. But we saw how God supernaturally chose Abraham, told him to leave his people and go to the land of Canaan, which would become the promised land much later on. And that was around 2075 BC. These dates are very approximate. Then we saw God give a great promise to Abraham, who was Abram at the time. And he promised him that he would make a great nation out of him. He would give him land. He would bless him. And he also referred to the seed, which later Paul, the Apostle Paul, in Galatians, clarifies that seed is not just Abraham's offspring, but specifically it was Christ. And that was somewhere between 2075 and 2000 BC. Then God gave Abraham circumcision as a sign of the covenant, and he supernaturally protected Abraham and Sarah, preserving their covenant line despite repeated threats as well as mistakes, I would say, that Abraham and Sarah made. And he supernaturally helped them to bear Isaac. Remember, Sarah was both barren, and both of them, Abram and Sarah, were old and they were advanced in age. And God emphasized here, and we'll see many times that later in today, as in other episodes, that divine intervention is above natural means or human effort or choice. So that was around 2045 BC. And then we see God test Abraham in offering of Isaac, which Abraham was prepared to do, but God stopped him. And then God put Abraham in a deep sleep, and he promised him through a covenant where God's Spirit went between the two halves of various sacrifices, which is something they would do back then. And that was around 2025 BC. And then later on, God chose Jacob over Esau as the covenant heir, and he renamed Jacob as Israel, which means one who struggles with God. And that continues, and then continues the promises given to Abraham through, that continued then with the promises that God had given to Abraham and Isaac. It continued to Jacob and onward. And that was around 2000 BC through, and also this promise, this wrestling match that God had with Jacob when he called him Isaac or Israel. That was around 1925 BC. Remember, BC goes backwards, so it gets the dates get smaller as time goes forward. And then God chooses Joseph over his 11 brothers. And we saw that this was the first time that the promise, or the lineage through which the promise would come, branches out from just one person to another, to their son, to a specific son, to when Jacob has 12 sons, God chooses Joseph as the one who, through providence, would bring them to Egypt. But he didn't, disprove of the other 11 brothers. It's from that point on that the people of Israel come from those 12 brothers. And that was around 1898 BC. And then God used Joseph to preserve Jacob's family through this terrible famine that occurred in that time. And he called, how do I say this? He called Joseph out of prison and had him interpret a dream very miraculously, and then interpret this dream of Pharaoh, which said there was going to be a famine, and then Pharaoh put Joseph as number 2 in command, just below him, and Joseph orders them to make silos for grain and so forth, and that was around 1876 BC. So at this point, things are really good between Egypt and the would-be or the fledgling Israel, which is really just one family at this point. And then God uses Joseph through miraculous interpretation of dreams. I was just talking about that. And as a result, I should say that this actually helped Egypt out. Egypt became a regional power. And so that's probably in the time range of 1885 through 1870. And I also put here the Bible chapters that you can find these things happening in. So from slavery to the promised land is the first slide. And this talks about the books of Exodus and Numbers. Now in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16, this is going back a little bit in time to the promise that God gave Abraham, but it was also, the promise came with prophecy. It says, "Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." I wanted to talk briefly about this 400-year period that God gives to Abraham. God gave Abraham this 400-year prophecy, and I should say that this is about, if you go with biblical timing and the ages of the various biblical fathers, that this is around 370 to 380 years after the flood. Now, Exodus 12, verses 40 through 41, it gives this 430-year period. It says, when the Israelite people lived in Egypt until the time when this Exodus is occurring, or when Exodus is being written, that was a 430-year period. So you have a 400-year period and a 430-year period. You could say, well, maybe God was just being sort of approximate with the 400, but it ended up being 430 years. But we also see Stephen in Acts chapter 7 quote Genesis 15 saying 400 years. But then we see Paul in Galatians chapter 3 quote from Exodus 12 the 430 years. So we see these numbers several times. So why the two different periods? I think the first period of 430, the longer period, I should say, of 430 years, so that would be around 1876 to 1446, approximate dates now, remember. And that is this idea that they were strangers in a foreign land. But here you can see that it says the 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. So the idea here is that the 400 years started a little bit later. So they were still in good terms with the Egyptians when they got sent to the land of Goshen and were herders, shepherds there. And so it was shortly thereafter that types of affliction started between the Egyptians and the Israelites, especially as their number grew and as they started to become a threat just implicitly through their size. Then that type of affliction increased until the point that we see that they were enslaved. So you can see how here the idea is that there's where you get this 400 years and 430 years. Okay, so let's look at some events, and remember again, I'll remind myself as well as you, that this is through the lens of promises and miracles. At this point, the promises have been given, and so what we'll see mostly is where God moved supernaturally, miraculously, to do different things involving this new nation. So we see that Israel multiplies in Egypt. So that's one of the reasons why God brought the people down to Egypt, to save them from the famine that was happening in Canaan. So Canaan wasn't so great at that time, but that famine also weakened the people who were in the promised land, which would then help Israel later on when they go to take that land. So Israel gets out of Canaan just in time to avoid this famine, and then ends up in Egypt and has a period of cooperation with Egypt. And in that time, they grow in number, but then also Egypt puts more and more restrictions on them. So that would be around the years of 1730 to 1526, and you can read about that in Exodus chapter 1. Then God preserves Moses from Pharaoh's decree. That was the decree to kill all of the young boy Israelites. I think it was below the age of 3. And that was because, again, now we're forward in time. We're around 1526 BC. And the number of Israelites has really grown. They had a really good birth rate, I guess you could say, even higher than the Egyptian birth rate. And that you can read about in Exodus chapter 2. Then, that reminds me, I wanted to read a verse that sort of exemplifies this period. So for this time period on this slide, I thought of Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And I will give you as a possession. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. So that's right about where we're at in this slide. So then God appears to Moses in this strange burning bush. You could call it the smokeless fire is one term that the ancients used to call it. But it's, I say in the modern vernacular that it's like a plasma. But basically it's light like a fire without the burning effects. That's what the Bible says, that the bush did not actually burn up and turn to charcoal. It's just that this, what's the word? Glowing gas is around it. So God reveals his name to Moses, Yahweh, and he promises to bring them out of Egypt into a good land. So that's around 1446 BC, Exodus chapters 3 through 4. God confronts Egypt through 10 plagues. This is a Bible story that many, many people around the world are familiar with, judging Egypt's gods and proving his power over Pharaoh. His magicians, court magicians, were able to replicate some of the plagues to a small degree, but they definitely did not replicate the further ones, the ones down the line. So you'll see this 1446 is a big year in the BC term. Again, remember these are approximate dates. It gets, the dates will become more and more accurate, more precise as we move closer to the present time. But at this point, it's very uncertain. I would say probably plus or minus 50 years or so. So then God institutes the Passover as a part of the 10th plague and delivers Israel from the death of the firstborn. So that was the 10th plague, that God would kill the firstborn son of anyone in this area who didn't have the blood of a sacrificed lamb over their doorframe. And of course, only the Israelites were told about this, so they prepared for that, and it established this holiday, this feast, this time as a later sign of redemption, this what we call the Passover. But the Egyptians did not know about it, and so there was a terrible thing that happened in Egypt, and it even happened to Pharaoh, his firstborn son. So then that is what the final straw was, that finally Pharaoh said, "Get out of here." And even after this, of course, we know he changes his mind. But God parts the Red Sea after Pharaoh's army chases after them. And here's where they are definitively freed from Israel. Israel is definitively freed from Egypt, because now there's a sea in between them. So that was the big year, 1446. Then God sustains Israel in the wilderness with miraculous water from rocks, and with manna and quail, and with victory over enemies. They're attacked a few times in that time period. And we know that was about 40 years. It could have been as little as 40 days. It really wasn't that difficult, that long a distance that they would have to trek from where they had just crossed the Red Sea to the Promised Land. But because of their faithlessness, they had to, that generation that was escaped, Israel, escape's not the right word, but was extricated by God, they had to die in the desert, and their children, the next generation, would be the ones who would take the Promised Land. And so that's also very miraculous that God would say that, and that Moses and the people would obey them and just wander around. Then God descends on Sinai and makes a covenant with Israel, gives them the law so that they may be his holy nation. And we know that started right when they left. They went up on the mountain and they got the 10 Commandments. Now we know that Moses later on, as they were wandering around the desert, came up with 603 other laws that they needed to follow in addition to the 10. So altogether it was 613 commands that made up the Old Covenant. But it started with the 10 that God gave Moses on the summit of Mount Sinai. Let's see. Though Israel rebels repeatedly, God remains present through the tabernacle and glory, guiding them and disciplining them in the wilderness. So again, that's this wilderness wandering period. Then at the end of that time period, Moses dies. He gets to look from a mountaintop into the Promised Land, but that's as close as he gets. And then God renews the covenant with a new generation, this younger generation that's now grown up in the plains of Moab, restating the law Israel and before Israel enters the land. So that's 1406, and you can read about that in Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 30. Deuteronomy, remember, meaning the second giving of the law. So it's the second time, same law, but it's the second time it's given. This time it's given to the children of those who had been delivered from Egypt. And then God brings Israel into the land under Joshua, parts the Jordan, so there's another river parting, or another body of water parting, and gives victories such as Jericho, and began fulfilling the land promise. So that would be around 1406 to 1399 BC, and you can read about that in Joshua chapters 1 through 6. So this slide is titled From Conquest to a United Kingdom, and it's from various books in the Old Testament. Joshua is the main one, but also Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, and 2 Samuel. So God, it's right, I wanted to read a verse from that. So this comes from Judges chapter 2, verse 16 through 18. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from their from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who had oppressed and afflicted them. So now, while this is before they had a king, so they're not a kingdom yet, but you can say they're a nation. They're a nation and a land with cities they didn't build and with vineyards they didn't plant. But there still are people who come in, enemies, who come in and try to retake their land. That's a good way of saying it, to retake their land. And God continues to protect the Israelites in this time period, this adolescent time period, with these what are called judges. Judges, I think, is the term that came because they're under the old covenant. And so you need a judge to deliver this covenant, a judge to be someone who rules over the covenant and says what is right and what is wrong. And God works miracles to them. You can think of like Samson and Delilah, for instance, or Deborah. So let's see. God continues giving Israel the land, though some areas remain unconquered because of Israel's incomplete obedience. We know the story, for instance, of the Gibeonites, the tricksters. So this time period is about 1406 to 1375 BC. You read about that in the book of Joshua. God renews the covenant at Shechem, calling Israel to choose faithfulness in the land he has given them. It's around 1400 BC, Joshua chapters 23 through 24. After Joshua, Israel falls into repeated cycles of apostasy, oppression, crying out deliverance under judges raised up by God. So that's a longer period of time before the first king in this era of judges, 1375 to 1050 BC. You can read about that in Judges chapter 2. God supernaturally delivers Israel through judges such as Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, showing that victory comes from him and not through human strength. So that's this time period of about 1250 through 1080 and the rest of the book of Judges. In a dark period, God preserves the covenant line through Ruth and Boaz, quietly advancing his redemptive plan. I don't have a lot of time to go into details on this, but you can read about that in the book of Ruth, and it's very interesting. You wouldn't even know necessarily how close God's plan came to not need to be changed or something like that, but God, of course, knows what's going on. And so these people end up in the lineage of Christ. So that's 1150 to 1100 BC. And God answers Hannah's prayer with Samuel and raises him as a prophet, judge, and a bridge from the judges to the monarchy. So that is a supernatural intervention. You can read about how Hannah was barren and how she promised that if she were able to have a child, that he would grow up in the temple. And so Samuel was that person. And then Samuel was called by God audibly somewhere around 1105 BC. And then it's Samuel who the people basically complained to about wanting to have a king like everybody else. I guess they weren't happy with the judges. And they pick a king, the first one, based on his appearance. Saul was tall, not the best criteria. Let's see. God judges Eli's house, allows the Ark crisis. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant is still with them at this time, and demonstrates that his holiness cannot be manipulated. 1080 BC. 1 Samuel chapters 4 through 7. That's an interesting all these are interesting stories. Remember, I had to condense these things so that we can get through this in a reasonable amount of time. Israel asks for a king like the nations. God grants Saul, warning that human kingship without obedience will fail. So that's around 1050 BC. God rejects Saul for disobedience and chooses David, a humble shepherd, showing again that God looks at the heart. Saul rejects Saul for disobedience. Oh, I just read that one. I was looking at the 1 Samuel 15 is actually, I think, one of the most interesting books in the Bible, as it has to do in the Old Testament, as it has to do with why Saul was rejected for not following God's commands exactly, even though following those commands exactly would really require not just amazing obedience, but amazing strength from all of the people. And really, it's a lesson about how God is really the only one who can deliver true justice. Even humans cannot deliver the type of justice that God delivers. God establishes David, gives victory over enemies, and makes the Davidic covenant, promising an enduring royal house. From 1010 to 970 BC, and this Davidic covenant is in 1000 BC. You can read about that in 2 Samuel 5 through 7. Okay, so from Solomon, that's David's son, to the exiles. So we'll be looking at 1st and 2nd Kings, 2nd Chronicles, and all of the 33 prophetic books, the major and minor prophets, are about this time period. So a good verse that exemplifies this slide is 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 13 through 14. Then the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. Turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets. But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors, who did not trust in the Lord their God. So we see that God gives Solomon wisdom, peace, and the temple, consecrating the kingdom, concentrating. They did consecrate the temple, but concentrating the kingdom, worship, and the promise in Jerusalem. That's 970 to 930 BC. Because of Solomon's later unfaithfulness, God declares that the kingdom will be torn, though not completely, for David's sake, for the covenant that God had sworn to David. So that was around 940 to 930 BC. Under Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, the kingdom divides into the northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. And that it's taken us 5 parts, almost 5 complete episodes, to get to where Judaism gets its name, from the southern kingdom of Judah. So this is a major covenant historical fracture, around 930 BC. Jeroboam leads Israel into false worship with golden calves, setting the pattern of northern rebellion against God around 930 BC and following. God repeatedly sends prophets to both kingdoms, warning that idolatry and injustice will bring covenant judgment. That's 870 to 700 BC. Though keep getting though and through mixed up. Through Elijah and Elisha, God performs striking miracles to confront Baal worship and show that he alone is a living God. These are also very interesting stories you can read. Despite prophetic warnings, the northern kingdom persists in sin until God sends Assyria to destroy Samaria and exile Israel. So at 722 BC, that is when the northern kingdom goes into exile. Judah experiences both reform and relapse, with kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah bringing temporary returns to covenant faithfulness. That's 715 through 609 BC. God miraculously delivers Jerusalem from Assyria in Hezekiah's day, proving that Judah's survival depends on him and not military power. That's 701 BC. But Judah finally does follow the path of persistent rebellion, and God sends Babylon to destroy Jerusalem and the temple and carry Judah into exile in Babylon and other places. So that ultimately was 586 BC, but this is a period of 605 to 586 BC. So that brings us up to the point where both the southern and northern kingdoms are exiled. And next week we will talk about from the exile all the way until the Messiah. So hopefully you found this interesting, and hopefully you will return next week to listen to and learn about this time of the exile time and the time with the Greeks and the early time with the Romans, and then of course Jesus coming on the scene around 30 AD being crucified. So have a great evening. Remember to like and subscribe, and I already said have a great evening. Have a great evening.